Okay, hi everyone. I think we'll just get started now. So thank you all for joining us today for this panel, to our alumni and students that are attending this session about careers in the US and nonprofits. So my name is Jenith. I'm the North America Opportunities Manager, and I'm based in St Andrews, and I'm part of the Career Service team. So these types of sessions are a great way to hear from our alumni directly about their individual journeys since leaving the University of St Andrews. We're very fortunate with the community that we have and how engaged our alumni are, and so we appreciate you all joining us today, especially at the moment. So today's session is in partnership with the US Development Team, and so I'll hand over to Leah now to introduce herself and her team.
Thanks, Jenith, and hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today, and another thank you to our panelists for being with us. So I just quickly want to introduce myself and the U.S. Development Team. As Jenith said, I'm Leah Dalton. I'm the Manager of Alumni and Family Engagement for the United States, and I work remotely pre-COVID times and right now, as we all do, from Maryland, and I'm joined here with three other colleagues who are also based in the U.S. So we have Catherine Humphreys, who's our head of development for the U.S., and she's located just outside of Philadelphia. We have Lily Wen, who is a gift officer outside Los Angeles, and she covers the western half of the country. And then we have Moira Sharkey, who is in Massachusetts, also a gift officer covering the eastern half of the country. So as a team, we work together to strengthen and engage our community of alumni, parents, students, and supporters in the U.S. And we work to build our network through lovely events like this, typically in person when we can, of course, but for now, virtually. And we also grow philanthropic support for the university from this community in the U.S. So I will actually put our contact details into the chat if you'd like to reach out to any of us, and we can continue the conversation there. But anyways, back to you, Jenith, and our panelists.
Great, thanks, Leah. So for everyone joining us today, please feel free to use the chat function and to ask any questions that you might have for our panelists. There will be an opportunity later for those to be answered. So you'll also be able to unmute, share your camera if you'd like, and you can kind of chat face to face as well. So I'd like to kick things off by asking the panel with you.
Jenith, it's Karen. If you can repeat again, because you just froze for a moment there.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
So if we just can start off the introductions. So Sally, I'll start with you. Thanks.
Oh, great. Thanks a lot, Jenith. Hello, everybody. Yes, I'm Sally O'Brien, and I think I'm probably the most ancient person here talking to you all. I graduated from St Andrews in 1982 with a degree in art history, and I went into a career initially in the Foreign Office, found my way to the United States, and have been in the nonprofit sector really ever since then. First working at Johns Hopkins University, and for the last 10 years at the Pew Charitable Trust. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation, especially listening to my fellow panelists, and happy to answer any questions that I can, and that hopefully it'll be useful and helpful for all the students who are participating.
Thanks, Sally. Melissa, if you would like to introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Melissa. Thank you for having me here today. So briefly, my position is Program Assistant with the German Marshall Fund of the United States. We are a nonprofit working on issue areas central to transatlantic cooperation. At the Asia program, we try to identify, understand, and address the challenges emanating from Asia, as well as align coordination between the US, Europe, and partners in the Indo-Pacific. So my role is principal operations support, as well as logistics lead for the Taiwan, Japan, and DC event portfolios. I also manage our intern program and provide research support. So functionally, I work on executing programming. So this can start with drafting grant proposals, and then after 6 months of planning, and with an international form. Although these days, for obvious reasons, we are online and virtual. So I graduated from St. Andrews in 2017, studied international relations with a particular focus on Asian security and US-China relations. And sort of having that degree, I wanted to gain experience sort of in the field. I thought that would be a way to sort of find an outlet for my interest in US-China relations, and tried and failed to get an internship in DC over the 3 years, my last 3 years at St. Andrews. Instead, building a marketing background in Florida. However, in the spring of my 4th year, I signed up for a work shadow program with a St. Andrews alumna who at the time worked at the National Defense University in DC, and I passed along my resume and was lucky enough to get an internship there. It did take me a while to sort of find a permanent position. I was an intern for multiple places, contract research assistant, volunteering. Eventually, I did get a chance to interview for GMF, which was surprising to me as someone an Asia hand. I was like, what is this Europe part? It feels a little out of the box, but it turns out, my experience at St. Andrews, sort of navigating these questions on the US and China in a very European environment, made me an excellent fit, and I've been there for 2 years now, and it's certainly been a privilege. I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you. And Ben, if you'd like to introduce yourself. Oh, I think you're on mute.
There we go. Sorry. So I'm Ben Rollinson-Plant. I graduated in 1994 with the same degree as Sally, so I've got an MA in History of Art. I left St. Andrews. I knew that I wanted to work in the arts, but I wasn't sort of quite sure. So I did a number of jobs. I worked for Miramax Films as a sort of office boy, sort of going out, getting people coffee. I then went to the Edinburgh Festival, and I worked in the press office at the Edinburgh Festival. I worked at the Peggy Guggenheim collection in Venice as an intern. Another St. Andrews friend had been there the year before and had got on the internship program and had come back and had raved about it. So I applied and I went out to Venice and lived out there for 4 months and had a fantastic time. And then I landed my first real job a couple of years later at Dulwich Picture Gallery as an assistant press and marketing officer. So I wasn't sort of quite sure sort of what I wanted to do in sort of museums, and I sort of found myself working in press and marketing. Went on to work at the National Portrait Gallery in London, at Tate as a press officer around the launch of Tate Modern, which was very, very exciting back in 2000. And then I got offered a job at a company called Brunswick, which is a communications firm, mainly deals with financial and corporate. But they thought it might be a good idea to also look at the arts. So I worked there for a number of years and became the managing partner of Brunswick Arts about 7-8 years ago. Anyway, sort of back in the new year this year, which sort of seems like an eternity ago, I started talking with the Guggenheim in New York. So subsequently, I'd moved to New York 4 years ago to set up Brunswick Arts in New York. So I started having a conversation with the Guggenheim here, and it sort of very much sort of appealed to me, having been an intern at the Peggy Guggenheim collection, and I was appointed the position of Deputy Director Global Public Affairs and Communications in April, so at the beginning of the pandemic, when New York was the epicenter of the pandemic. So it's been a very, very interesting journey to date, and I can sort of tell you more about it, but it's great to be speaking to everyone here today, and thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Okay, great. So we'll move on to the questions. So Melissa, I'm going to come to you first. So if you could tell me what was your key standout during your time at St. Andrews?
Yeah, so great question. I think my first instinct is to say the student meal deal at MISHA, but there must be more than that. So following, I would say, my IR courses, especially the final 2 years, when you sort of get the opportunity to pick these selective classes, and then within that, you can sort of you have the freedom at St. Andrews to tailor essays to issues you're particularly interested in. So for me, I would take something like conflict analysis, and then with my interest in Asia, I'd be writing essays on the South China Sea or the Sino-Indian border issue. And so that was a great way to sort of get this knowledge of these larger sort of technical parts of international relations and then relate it to something I really loved. And I think that's a skill sort of if you're interested in sort of the research and writing part of nonprofits, that's really valuable, learning how to take a prompt and sort of execute really to what you're interested in.
Great, thank you, Melissa. Okay, so Ben, I'm going to come to you next. Why do you love the work that you do?
That's a great question. I mean, my love for history of art was really sort of developed at St. Andrews. Originally, I applied to read medieval history and then realized that there was a more interesting subject called art history available. And the great thing about St. Andrews, I mean, I don't know whether it sort of holds true now, but, you know, the first 2 years you could take 3 subjects each year. So, you know, you could sort of play around a little bit. So I discovered sort of history of art as a subject and never realized that I could actually sort of take it further and turn it into a career. And what I've been able to do is sort of take the subject I love and then take other interests such as, you know, the media. I've always been very, very interested in the way the media operates and, you know, sort of marketing and audiences. And I now look after sort of digital and design as well at the Guggenheim. So it's a sort of combination of loves, really. And then I feel like I've just gone sort of full circle, having been this sort of intern at the Peggy Guggenheim collection, whenever it was back in 1996, to now looking after all the sort of global communications for, you know, the Guggenheim constellations. So New York, Venice, Bilbao. And in 7 years' time, we'll have a museum in Abu Dhabi. And I've done a lot of work in the Middle East over the time as well. So it sort of just, it combines many loves. So I feel very fortunate.
Great, thank you. And Sally, I'm going to come to you next. So how did your time at St. Andrews affect your career path?
It's so interesting, especially listening to everybody else. In a sense, it, you know, I don't even know if it did really. You know, I did this. I'm exactly the same as Ben, and I trotted into St. Andrews, all eager to, you know, read history, which I really loved. And I did medieval history in my first year, and I loved that too. But I also discovered art history, and so I was drawn into that, and absolutely loved it. I loved the blending of the sort of the visual narrative of social, political, cultural history, the context that it creates. It was just really, it just felt so multidimensional and interesting, which really, I think, played into sort of my own interests. I just am very, you know, Catholic with a small c, interested in so many different things. My career has really, in a sense, I suppose you could say, has reflected that, you know, as Melissa and Ben were saying, St. Andrews does have that freedom in the structure of the curriculum to really allow you to wander about and dip your toe into a variety of different things. So I really got to do that. In addition to, obviously, you know, all the art history, I also was the director of the St. Andrews Arts Festival, and again, sort of just jumped into that, and suddenly found myself running a 2-week-long arts festival with performances and exhibits and shows and readings and radio broadcasts. We had Just a Minute, I think, broadcast from the Younger Hall during the festival. We created a cafe, which, you know, with student chefs. They'd never allow any of that now, but I mean, we had a little industry running there, and it was, you know, all mad things. It was held in February in St. Andrews for 2 weeks. We had street theatre, and it was amazing. We actually had people performing, and we had audiences, and it was a really extraordinary experience. We wrote grants, we got money, we got the Scottish Chamber Orchestra to perform. So anyway, we did all of those things, and at the end of all of, and I had a fantastic time at St Andrews, just loved it. And then, of course, it was okay, I've got to get a job. And I did. I'm filled with admiration, Ben, for your, kind of sticking to your guns there. I dabbled in the idea of arts administration, doing something with my art history degree. And then there was this thing called the milk round. I don't know if they still have that anymore, but all these companies and organizations would show up. And it was a bit like full circle. My first week at St Andrews, they had all the societies in Younger Hall, and you'd sort of go around and sign up. My best friend and I signed up for the God knows why we did that. That was hilarious. But anyway, so we signed up for all these different things. And then suddenly 4 years later, it's another group of organizations saying sign up. And I applied to all sorts of things. There were really, nobody was coming to St Andrews in those days. And remember, this is pre-email, pre the internet, pre anything. I mean, we had the post. And so it was, it was very significant that these organizations came to St Andrews, and we were able to learn a bit about what they did. But they were all advertising, banking, government offices. There were no arts organizations at all. So I kind of, in a sense, I was limited by what was available, and I signed up for all sorts of things. I applied to J. Walter Thompson, the former CEO of which is a very, very close friend, and I've always given him grief that they never gave me the job. And I applied to some banks and things like that. But anyway, I ended up applying for the Foreign Office, and I landed in that. And ultimately, actually, it was a great place to be. Again, it fueled my interest in history, sort of internationalism, and was very, again, it's when you're in the Foreign Office, you're a jack of all trades, a master of none. And actually, I think my career in the nonprofit sector has followed that path. I've become very adept at adapting to a whole range of different issues and topics. Have never really actually specifically focused in on anything. And had I done that, from leaving St Andrews and sort of really drilled into the arts, it might have looked very different, and it might have been in some ways more rewarding. But I still don't regret, the path that I've taken.
That's great, thank you. And so, Melissa, I'm going to come to you next. What advice would you give students who will be navigating the job market in the next few years?
Sure. So talk to people, start to figure out sort of who's doing what you're interested in. So a network is really valuable. I'm sure you have probably heard that before. And so what people will keep saying is you have to actively work to build it. So I would say don't be hesitant to reach out to people. It can be uncomfortable. I certainly have sent many emails that went unresponded, but please give it a shot. I think it's the best way to sort of build opportunities for yourself, and also figure out what you're actually interested in, and sort of what someone's job looks like. Is that something you're interested in? Networking, making contacts, just sort of getting past that barrier of, oh my God, strangers, I don't want to pick up the phone or call, which I think, millennials, sometimes we are a little hesitant with that. Yeah.
Thank you, Melissa. So Ben, I'm going to come to you next. How has the non-for-profit world responded to COVID-19?
Oh my goodness. Well, I mean, I was working in a for-profit at Brunswick until April, and then was sort of, plunged straight into this different world. I mean, in terms of the Guggenheim, I mean, one of our biggest challenges has been that we had to close the museum in New York. Well, Bilbao Venice closed earlier back in February, but we closed the museum in New York, I think on March the 16th, so just before I started. And that's had a huge impact on our revenue. So we're currently losing, or were losing until we reopened on the 3rd of October, we were losing $1.4 million a month in revenue. 33% of our revenue is from admission. So we're looking at a rather large deficit this year. I don't know whether that sort of applies to all non-for-profits. So our development team, we call them the advancement team at the Guggenheim, have got a really big job, and as fill that gap. So I would say sort of financially, that's been like a major challenge. But then, sort of on the back of COVID, with the death of George Floyd and the protests that sort of came about as a result of that, all sorts of sort of issues have been thrown up into the air within particularly sort of museums and arts organizations, accusations of sort of racism. We had, it still sort of exists, a whole social media campaign set up by our staff, both sort of employees and former employees, called A Better Guggenheim, which was sort of calling out on a daily basis various sort of issues within the organization. So sort of, contending with that has been a massive challenge. But I mean, the good news is that we've reflected a lot as an organization. We've begun to sort of think about sort of, ways that we might change and that we might sort of develop as an organization. And we've got a DEAI plan, a diversity, equity, access and inclusion plan that we pulled together at sort of breakneck speed, and it's now we're now we're now enacting on this plan, which is something the organisation of course should have done years ago. So I feel like we've really changed, and when we reopened on the 3rd of October, we were certainly a different organisation to the one that had closed on March the 16th.
Great, thank you. I think that will be the case for many. And Sally, I'm going to come to you next. How has your organisation adapted to virtual life?
Well, remarkably well. Just picking up on what Ben was saying, financially, certainly I think it's been a little challenging, but I think Pew was challenged prior to that anyway, in that Pew has got the advantage of being the sole beneficiary of 7 trusts, which have provided a steady stream of revenue to the organization. But $1 in $5 that's spent by Pew is donor money, and certainly it's been challenging to maintain and to cultivate and develop those relationships in order to provide new sources of revenue for new initiatives and new ideas. But that aside, I think at the beginning of the pandemic, primarily Pew is a policy organization. The Pew Research Center is a little separate from the Pew Charitable Trust, same parent organization. The center does a lot of polling, and they've been extremely busy. But for the trust, our policy work, we really felt, I think, there was a lot of concern that the efforts to get policy moved forward either at the state or the federal level would be very challenged by the pandemic. We too shut down on March the 17th. We have about 1,000 people working at Pew. We're all remote, and we've got great technical support and so forth. So we've been able to adapt pretty well with WebEx and through email and so on. And surprisingly, I think the momentum on our work has actually been able to move forward. I mean, of note, in particular, was the passage a month or so ago of the Great American Outdoors Act, which really provided a solution to the deferred maintenance deficit in the national parks in this country, which was at a level of about $20 billion. And Pew, we'd had a six-year campaign working with the National Parks Foundation and with others to build a bipartisan push to get this legislation passed to address this issue. And if you think about the political turmoil, the challenges, the difficulties of the current administration, it really, and then the pandemic on top of that, the ability to get Congress to stay focused on this issue and push it over the finish line was really wonderful. And it was a very bright moment in what's been a very dark and rather sad few months. So, we've adapted very well. And I would just build on what Ben was saying about the events surrounding the death of George Floyd, because that has been felt very deeply across the board. I'm sure in the UK just as much as it has in the US, but strongly here. And Pew also has taken a lot of time, I think, to do some internal exploration and to sort of amp up its diversity and inclusion effort, and to think about how these events are going to shape the portfolio of Pew's work moving forward. There's no question that it's going to influence the decisions, and Pew is a very sort of issue agnostic organization. It doesn't have a single focus on a particular area of work, and so it tends to look for opportunities to make a difference where it can count and where Pew's contributions are valued. And I think that the events of the last few months with the death of George Floyd will undoubtedly influence that direction in the future.
Thanks, Sally. So just a quick reminder for those attending to pop some questions in the chat, and we'll get to those kind of towards the end. So feel free to pop those in at the moment. So Melissa, I'm going to come to you next. So there will be people on this call who are looking to change career or move into this career, or start in this career, sorry. So what are the skills and experience that your organisation is looking for?
Sure. So it certainly varies across programs. GMF is 12 programs across 8 offices internationally, but so I can speak to the Asia program in particular and sort of what I value in an intern and a teammate, and I think that goes to skills like organization and a positive attitude, being able to multitask and be flexible. I mean, really, sort of the best teammate essentially is someone who can jump into the fray, turn things around quickly, and just sort of not get overwhelmed by it all in a negative way, because it's certainly being a entry-level employee or intern, it can be humbling. And so I think really, someone who is willing to just sort of dive in and dig in, it's such a valuable quality.
Great, thanks, Melissa. Ben, how has the sector changed in the last few years? What do you predict will happen in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, these are really big questions. So, I mean, I'll obviously talk about the US sector, and I've been here for 4 years, so I don't know what happened in the year before I arrived, but it's, I mean, as we were saying, and as Sally was saying, I mean, the whole issue of diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. Really, when I arrived in the US, I couldn't sort of quite understand why more progress wasn't being made around this. And when I was at Brunswick, I got together with some of my colleagues, and we called a meeting at Brunswick to talk about sort of diversity in arts organizations. And we just sort of sent it out to various New York-based organizations, and 18 people from 18 organizations showed up to have this conversation. And it was a really difficult conversation to have, but we sort of talked about the sort of the issues that each of the organizations were facing, and everyone was having the same sort of problems. And we then went on to commission a film around a particular program that MoMA in New York was running with LaGuardia College in New York, which is one of, I think, the most sort of diverse educational institutions in the country. And it was a mentorship program, and the film focused on this one guy, Matteo, who'd come from Colombia, and he'd arrived in New York at the age of 14, not speaking any English. Anyway, he was extremely bright. He went to LaGuardia. He got on this mentorship program, and it completely sort of changed his life. He sort of realized that, in fact, that he could get a job in an arts organization, and he was very, very sort of skilled at sort of maths, and I think is now at Stanford reading sort of further maths or whatever he's reading, but wants to come back into an arts organization and work within it. So I suppose, yeah, really to answer your question is that there's a real sort of appetite now to open up, sort of diversify what traditionally has been a very white profession, museums. I mean, it's some people like myself who went to universities like St. Andrews who sort of get the jobs. And, this is something that really has to change. I mean, not just in the US, but in places like the UK too. So having a plan like the plan that we've pulled together is really essential to help make that change happen.
Great, thank you. And Sally, what do you wish you'd known when you started out your career? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. Boy, you know, well, I think one of the things, and this is speaking from the perspective of, you know, being a woman who graduated in 1982. And, you know, while I didn't really give it a great deal of thought at the time, in retrospect, I have really come to realize that, you know, the world was not designed for, you know, in my favor particularly. And it might have been, you know, a little easier had I not jumped straight into the Foreign Office, which, let's remember, up until the sort of early 1970s, mid 1970s, a woman in the Foreign Office and a diplomat, and you decided to get married, you had to leave. It's just really unbelievable when you think about it. So I think I was a little, you know, unaware of the, you know, I think being at St Andrews was a little bit of a little kind of bubble. You know, it was sort of felt, you know, innocent times, and none of us really, I think, even, I mean, talking to my peer group, who I'm still very close to, I just don't think the world felt very complicated for us. And we all sort of drifted down to London, and we all sort of stumbled into jobs without a great deal of difficulty, really, and sort of got on with life. And it's a lot more complicated now. I do think that had I been more intentional about what I wanted to do, and not that I necessarily even thought I knew, but had I been a little bit more driven and intentional, it might have been to my advantage. On the other hand, I mean, a piece of advice I would give, particularly to, you know, new graduates, you know, from the perspective where I'm sitting now, you know, it was 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago, that I walked into St Andrews. And, you know, gosh, you have such a lot of life ahead of you. And not to be open to new opportunities and spontaneity and being flexible, I think, can really be detrimental. So it's a fine line to walk. I definitely think Melissa's advice to build your networks and stay connected is a really important one. But I would counsel, you know, if someone's interesting to you, you know, get to know them and be connected with them. Don't necessarily be sort of dismiss them if they happen to be, you know, in banking and you're interested in the arts, because you absolutely never know where those things may connect. And I mean, I was just actually reading a biography of it's a little book written by one of our St Andrews alumni, Mick May. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Mick. I'm just going to get it so I can give him a promo. But it's a good example. Here it is. It's called Cancer and Pisces, or Pisces, depending on your pronunciation. And Mick was at St Andrews with me. He went into investment banking. He actually had a very dire diagnosis of cancer, which he overcame against many odds. But anyway, he's written this book. But I'm reminded about it because he working, having gone to Eton and then St Andrews and then into merchant banking, a very predictable route, ended up working in doing work to help offenders who've served their prison sentences come back into the community and be productive citizens. And along the way had somewhat of a sort of spiritual journey as well. And I think that when you reflect back on a life that you've lived, being open to those friendships and connections, and recognizing that your career can actually take lots of different turns that you might not necessarily anticipate, as you're about to graduate from St Andrews, is it really important, because otherwise you'll deprive yourself, I think, of all that the world has to offer.
That's great. Thanks, Sally. Some sound advice. And so, Melissa, I'm going to come to you next. is there a standout moment in your career which was a real step change, and how did you bring this about?
So, I am still, I think, starting things out. So, getting the job, first of all, was such a sigh of relief after interning and volunteering for an extended amount of time in DC. But I think once in this role, it's been such a privilege to help manage the intern program. And this sort of came about when I had some fantastic colleagues get really amazing opportunities elsewhere, and there's this gap in management who was going to take over this program. And practically someone needed to do it, and I was available, and so I offered to do so. And sort of when everything came back together again, the job stuck. And I think this sort of goes to the idea that it's sort of, if you see see an issue, be proactive, sort of put yourself forth as the solution, really just try and be part of that solution process. And it really shows that you're able to take on challenges and deserve more responsibility or recognition in sort of whatever form it takes. So yeah, thanks for asking.
Great, thank you. And Ben, I'm going to come to you next. How might a Biden administration impact this sector?
Remains to be seen. I mean, without getting too political, I mean, hopefully it will prove to be positive. I mean, I think a lot of the internal issues we've had, and a lot of the sort of activism that we've had within the Guggenheim, I feel is a reaction against the current administration. I think it's brought a lot to a head, and it's created a lot of sort of tensions, and hopefully, sort of good things will come out of it. We don't receive any federal money. I mean, very few arts organizations. I mean, the Smithsonian in DC does, but very few arts organizations actually receive any money from the government here in the US. And we don't get any city money either, so it won't impact us financially. I think that just in terms of the Guggenheim as an international organization with our museums in Europe, and our museum, which will be opening in Abu Dhabi in several years' time. Hopefully this will be a positive thing in terms of a US-based organization and how we interact with the world.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to move on to questions from the attendees. So we've got one so far from Savannah. So I'm just going to open this out to the floor. So first one to unmute, I guess. So how can you make your job application stand out when applying to a nonprofit? Yeah, Melissa, on you go.
So I guess I can answer this since I review a lot of resumes in the intern program. So I think one thing I always notice is, and you hate to even say it, but like spelling mistakes. Proofread everything, your cover letter, your resume, and really take the time to look at the job description and sort of take out the key skills they're talking about. Sort of what are they really trying to say, and find a way to sell your experience to that skill. Because I think if you can extract sort of working at a cafe as customer experience and really highlight that, it's not a negative, it's an attribute if you're sort of putting why it is. And so sort of taking that approach to your resume as well as for your cover letter, we can tell when you haven't sort of edited it in any way that to the organization. So take the effort to do that. Read through the mission, the job position, what the organization is working on or the program's working on. The time really pays off when someone's reading it at the other end.
Perfect, thanks, Melissa. Sally, Ben, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, I would just go back to this idea of network. I mean, it's not always that simple, particularly not in COVID times. But I remember when I first started out, and I wrote to 10 arts organizations. And again, it was sort of back in the day, I think just before sort of email. So, you know, all sort of handwritten, sent them off asking just for a cup of coffee with, you know, people working in press and marketing at places in London. And probably about 3 of them got back to me, which wasn't sort of, you know, wasn't such a sort of, you know, bad success rate. I went and I had a coffee with those 3 people. And I remember exactly who they were and asked them for their advice. I just asked them, you know, what they would do if they were starting out. And then when it came to applying to jobs, I mean, one of the jobs I got at the National Portrait Gallery was because I'd met with that person 2 years prior. So I think if you can put a name to a face, I think that really, really helps. And the other thing I would say, and I think maybe Melissa, you mentioned this, is I wouldn't worry about just reaching out to people, and, you know, don't take sort of, you know, personal offense if people don't respond. You know, reach out to people, and you know, I'm always happy if someone comes to me and I have, you know, the time. I'm always happy to you know, I always respond to people's emails, and, you know, I would also sort of, you know, take the time to talk someone through, you know, how to go about sort of applying to work in arts organizations. So I think sort of don't hold back, and you know, be a little pushy.
Thank you. And Sally, do you want to add anything on?
Very sound advice from my fellow panelists. You know, I really would second the importance of, if you are actually specifically applying for a position that's been posted, and it seems a little bit obvious, but really do take the time to put yourself in the shoes of that institution and think about what is that institution about, what is it trying to accomplish, and then how do you then shape your application so that it really looks as if you paid attention to that. But beyond that, in terms of what Ben is talking about, the contacting people and having conversations, I too have done this, and I'm glad to do it. And I have found that I'm often asked by other colleagues in other organizations to you know, put in a good word for somebody who's applying to Pew, and I will always carry that forward. I can't promise anything, but I'll absolutely put in a good word. And so, you know, if you do know if there's a particular organization that you're interested in working in, and you can do a little bit of research to see what kind of a network is there, how does my network connect into that organization? It may be that you know somebody in one organization, but you happen to know that they're on the board of, you know, an organization with some indirect relationship to the place you're trying to go and work for. But leverage that network and say, look, I see that you serve on this board. Would you mind making an introduction? Because I really want to work at the Smithsonian, for example. I mean, just as an example, the person who runs all of the fundraising at the Smithsonian is a former colleague of mine at Johns Hopkins. So now, you know, so if you did a bit of digging around, you'd say, oh, look, Sally went to Johns Hopkins. She worked at Hopkins. I see that the head of development at the Smithsonian also was at Hopkins. She was in that. Maybe she knows him. Maybe she would be willing to put in a good word for me. So it's that kind of a thing that I think it takes a bit of detective work and sleuthing, but it's definitely worth doing. And the only other thing I would say is that having a general sense of what you might want to do is useful, because I think when people are giving you the time to talk, I've done this, you know, for children of friends of mine, where they vaguely want to go into the nonprofit sector, but they don't really know what they really want to do. They don't really have a particular field or a passion or an area of interest. Then it becomes really difficult, any useful advice. And so, you know, I think the nonprofit sector is huge. I mean, it kind of mirrors, you know, the world. So do you want to do humanitarian work? Do you want to do something in the environment? Is it the arts that's really the area that you want to focus on? And I think at least narrowing things a little bit into those sorts of buckets can be very helpful in your sort of networking pursuits.
That's great. Thanks, Sally. Lucy, I can see you've got your hand up. So do you have a question?
Hi there. Yes, this is just one for the whole panel, and thank you. Such an interesting discussion and great responses to the questions coming at you. It's really fascinating. I'm just wondering, and this is really open to any of you, all of you, to answer, how you would see, I'm apologising actually in advance here, I've got a bad network quality message coming up on my screen again, so if you lose me, I apologise, I'll try and rejoin. Really, I'm just wondering how much value you would place on volunteering as a perhaps initially, as Sally was saying, perhaps as a means of exploring what area of the non-profit sector you want to go into, and also as a means of enhancing your own experience and getting to where you want to go. We had a question from a student that couldn't be here tonight, and we're going to send the recording on to him tomorrow, so I think he would be particularly interested in this.
Can I jump in on that? Because I've heard that so often, and I really think it depends on the area. I mean, you can volunteer in an animal shelter, and it's real work, it's needed, and it's a wonderful opportunity to bond with animals and so forth. Volunteering, Pew had an internship program for a number of years, and it was not successful, and we stopped it because, in fact, what people were ending up having to do, and maybe Melissa can talk to this, is being sent off to sort of photocopy documents and things like that. That really doesn't contribute to your ability, your opportunities to learn. I think that certainly if it's a way of exploring an area, and does that area sort of gel with any passion? So, for example, taking the time to volunteer in a museum, perhaps learn how to be a docent or how to give tours, or that kind of thing, where there are specific things and functions for volunteers, I think is a great way to learn about your aptitude and your taste for it. But I think there are a lot of jobs in the nonprofit world where it's actually quite difficult to get your foot in the door as an intern, although Melissa has proven us completely wrong in this. So it may be that things have changed a lot, but I think it depends largely on the nature of the work.
That's very good advice, Sally. Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess to add on to that, maybe, unless Ben, you wanted to jump in. Oh, okay, great. So, I mean, so in the foreign policy space, volunteering, I mean, Peace Corps is certainly an option, but I think for us, when I see volunteering on a resume, if someone's really passionate about a campaign issue or something like that, it's a valuable organization skill. I mean, someone who's able to lead in that manner, it's super valuable. I would separate volunteering and interning, because that's what I was doing. I was volunteering for an issue I was passionate about, but sort of spending 9 to 5 on another internship in the sort of year and a half I was in DC trying to find a permanent position. So I think it's a great way to fill time. And as Sally says, if it's relevant to the sort of role you're hoping to get, it's certainly is valuable there. But as far as, just having sort of, I guess, be thoughtful in what you're doing. If it's passionate, or if it's something you're passionate about, absolutely go forth and do it. There should be no reason, a resume or the thought of a checklist on a resume should hold you back. But it's not necessarily a substitution for sort of more targeted experience.
I just sort of add to that. I completely agree, and I think that sort of differentiating between internships and volunteering is something to consider. I mean, it did give me my internship at the Peggy Guggenheim way back in the day did give me a really good understanding on the way a museum works. It also gave me something on my resume that sort of people seem to sit up and take notice of. I mean, one other thing I would say, and we have a policy of it now within the Guggenheim, is I really strongly believe in paying people for their time. And I know that's not always sort of applicable to every non-for-profit, but I think if someone's coming to work for you, you need to give them something back, not just sort of experience.
Thank you, Ben.
If I can just add in just a second on that, is that, and again, this is not a St Andrews experience, but it's actually my son who went to RISD and he's a painter. But while he was at RISD, he did a Christie's internship and over the summer. And so this goes back to thinking about your passion, but then really looking at organizations and do they run internships in a way that really gives you the opportunity to develop some skills. And as I just said, Pew really did a terrible job at it. I'm not talking out of school here. We all acknowledge that. Christie's, on the other hand, and I don't know if they still do it, but they did a phenomenal job. And I mean, they actually put him to work. He had to work on a catalogue for the annual American furniture sale at Christie's, and he was sent off all around New York to help, do all the legwork to determine the provenance of various pieces that were in the sale and so forth. It was a very real piece of work. It wasn't necessarily something that made him then say, yippee, this is what I want to do. But it was a valuable thing, I think, to Ben's point, perhaps for the Guggenheim Fellowship. So look into it carefully. And I think that's a really important thing. Is are you actually going to be doing something, hopefully paid for, but where you're going to actually dip your toe into the field of that piece of that work and actually gain some experience that's relevant. Just really be careful that you're not going to be just being sent out for coffee, unless it's being, second grip on some, major movie. That seems to be on movies.
So yeah, actually just jumping back in there as well. So say you've gotten an internship, it sounded great on paper, you're in it, and then you're making copies all day, or, calling organizations to figure out which email is up to date. You have some agency in this role. This isn't what you expected it to be. So how are you going to turn it around? Just would recommend being proactive, going to your supervisor as much as you can without it sort of grading them. They're very busy too, and saying, what can I do to help? Or I saw you have this coming up. Can I do X for this? So, if they're not giving you everything you need, feel free to ask for what you're looking for. And people will be impressed by your agency.
Thank you all very much. That's really helpful.
Great, thanks everyone. So that basically takes us to time. So just want to give a huge thanks to our panel for joining us today. We really appreciate that. And I just want to take a moment to just encourage you all to take a look at Think Connect as well, and sign up if you haven't already. So there is over 3,000 alumni on there, ready to network and answer any questions that you may have. So yeah, you should definitely check that out if you haven't. And for the students as well, to direct you all to Careers Matters, which is a weekly roundup of what's happening within the career service and any upcoming events. We're having weekly regular discussions with a number of employers and alumni across sectors who want to do events with us directly. So keep an eye out on those details. So yeah, thanks again to our panelists. And yeah, hope you all enjoy your rest of your days, evenings, mornings, wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.